Competitive Pokemon is run by an evil shadow organization called Smogon. Through careful brainwashing and propaganda campaigns, they control the narrative, pushing people away from the honest and altruistic metagame supported by Pikachu himself, VGC doubles. Instead, they want people to play their evil, hate-fueled metagame of Overused, a 6v6 singles format where they have all the power. The OU Council has total control over what's allowed and what isn't, banning any Pokemon that goes against their mysterious ethos, with some theorizing that they have very powerful benefactors, lobbying to ensure that their elite Pokemon allies never face the same scrutiny as other banned Pokemon. Is this all true? Am I exaggerating for dramatic effects? Perhaps, but in all seriousness, it is a point of confusion and controversy for a lot of people that competitive singles is governed by the fan community of Smogon. And this sub-community of competitive players exists separately to the official formats pushed by the Pokemon Company. What is their philosophy behind the confusing OU tier? And why do they choose to ban some things and not others? Why do they get to choose what these Pokemon formats look like? Let's explore Smogon's philosophy for what a competitive metagame should look like, and why not everyone agrees with them. The existence of Smogon in the first place is pretty interesting, and I have a whole video detailing how Smogon came to exist and why there is a fan format for singles and an official format for doubles, which is a unique case in esports. If you want to hear more specifically about that and the pros and cons of each format, you can check out the video Competitive Pokemon's Greatest Debate. But to summarize why this Smogon fan community exists in the first place, it's kind of similar to why games like Smash Bros. And TF2 have fan communities for their competitive rule sets. Because back in the day, competitive Pokemon in an official capacity was not really taken as seriously by the Pokemon Company. There were official tournaments, but they were very rarely held and were more of a novelty event than a serious esport at the time. There was also a significant barrier to entry in the older games with training competitive-ready teams. So it fell on the fan communities to come up with their own competitive rule sets at this time. And that's how Smogon formed around Generation 4. And then later on, as the Pokemon franchise progressed, the Pokemon Company did push official competitive formats much more. So therefore you have these two coexisting formats, the official way to play, which was pushed later into the franchise, and the fan-made Smogon rule sets, which existed before official competitive was really a reasonable thing to get into. And Smogon has a very different philosophy on how to handle their rule sets than VGC. VGC rule sets are very simple, I think, by design. There are a clear list of banned Pokemon called Restricteds that sometimes you can bring one or two of, or sometimes none of them at all. And this is a clear list of Pokemon. Mythicals are banned, that's fairly easy to understand, and then there's rules like the item clause, where no Pokemon can hold the same item on a team. VGC rule sets will update every few months, allowing certain things and disallowing certain things, but generally you can read a pretty easy list of the differences and understand the format. This was a smart way to go for official events, as it simplifies things and makes everything very uniform, and the rotation of formats also keeps things fresh. Smogon, on the other hand, operates a bit differently, and this is what confuses people, understandably, because Smogon actually has a bunch of different formats that all exist at the same time. Their main format is called Overused, and it's probably the one you've heard of, and maybe you think it's the only format people care about, but no, there's heaps of formats. At the top of the totem pole is Ubers, where the most powerful Pokemon in the game reside. Kind of like the restricted list of VGC, these are the Pokemon you can expect to see here. Legendaries like Koraidon, Ho-Oh, Mewtwo, etc. Right below that you have Overused, which is the most popular competitive singles format. All the Ubers Pokemon are banned from being used here, but everything else is fine. And this is where Smogon's usage-based tiering system comes into play. Pokemon are tagged OU if they are used in the OU tier in at least 4.52% of games. If a Pokemon is below that usage threshold of 4.52% usage in OU, they will fall to the next tier, which is called Underused. Underused is its own format where everything OU and above is banned, and then the chain goes on. A Pokemon is tagged UU if they have 4.52% usage or more in the UU tier. If not, they fall down to RU, and then there's NU below that, and PU below that, and ZU below that. This is part of Smogon's philosophy, this usage-based tiering system that creates multiple formats where different power levels or weight classes of Pokemon can all exist and all be valid. In Gen 9's never used tier, for example, Flamigo is a top tier threat, as is Monkey Dory, Pokemon that would never see any use in any other tier, but because everything in the usage tiers above them is banned, they exist at their own power level and can battle with Pokemon around their level. So not only does every single generation of Pokemon have multiple different formats you can play under Smogon's rule sets, these formats also exist for the entire generation. It's not like OU has rotating rule sets where, you know, in one rule set Paradox Pokemon are allowed and some there aren't. There aren't these rule set shifts to create variety. Instead, the formats change and shift over time. And that's why bans take place and rule set updates take place. Over the course of a generation, usage will change, meaning Pokemon will rise into OU and fall from OU as things shift, as the metagame adapts. This is where some confusion comes in, because it is a little bit easier to understand the VGC system. There's just one rule set people are playing at one time, with these rules, and that's it. Whereas in Gen 9 OU, the Gen 9 OU of today is completely different to the Gen 9 OU of last year, or even 6 months ago, because probably some bans have happened since then. So there are clear differences in the timelines of these formats. Smogon just has this one format that exists throughout the entire generation and shifts over time, whereas VGC will have a format that doesn't change at all, that is completely set in stone, but the current format that people are playing changes constantly. So in the main competitive singles format of OU, the most popular one, what exactly determines whether something is too powerful? Why do things get banned in the first place? What makes something ban-worthy in these formats? And this is where things start to sound insane, and it sounds like this format is run by a weird shadow organization, because for every format, there is a tier leader, and then there is a tier council, and they sort of have control over this, over what gets banned and what doesn't. These council members are usually long-standing tournament players and people who have been on the Smogon forums for a long time that have a very deep understanding of the game or just played it a lot. So there are two ways that a Pokemon actually gets banned. One of them is called a quick ban, and this is when just the council themselves votes on the fate of a Pokemon. Each member of the council can vote and say whether they want to ban the Pokemon or not ban the Pokemon. And if a majority is reached, that outcome will occur. The other way a Pokemon gets banned is through a suspect test, and this is where the community gets to vote on the fate of a Pokemon. The council will announce that a suspect test is happening, and the way that you vote is you make a new account, usually with a prefix in the username to signify that you are taking part in the suspect test. And then you have to reach a certain rank on the Pokemon Showdown ladder to be eligible to vote. So there's a barrier to entry. Not everyone can vote. You have to be good enough at the game to achieve this certain ladder rank to then be eligible to vote. If 60% of the voters or more vote for the Pokemon to be banned, they will be banned. So there's actually a bit of a stricter requirement to ban via suspect test. You need 60% of people to vote in favor of banning the Pokemon. So that's the actual process of banning itself and the two ways a Pokemon can get banned. But why would you single out certain Pokemon and say they are ban-worthy and say that this vote is going to take place for them to decide their fate? The most common case of a Pokemon being ban-worthy is that they are so powerful that they are restricting variety in the metagame. The classic example I always use is Dracovish, because Dracovish had such an insane damage output with Vicious Rend that it could one-hit KO just about everything, including resistances. This led to a situation where most teams in the game were using Dracovish because of its overwhelming power, and most teams in the game were also running hard counterplay to Dracovish. Seismitoad was the common one. Seismitoad has water immunity, so it was on almost every team during the Dracovish metagame. If you imagine that this was a traditional competitive game, where frequent balance patches happen and nerfs, probably the developers would nerf Dracovish, because it's clearly this overpowered thing, and they would iterate on their design. Whoops, we didn't realize Dracovish was so broken, but Pokemon is different. You cannot actually patch Pokemon, and they don't really ever patch Pokemon. So if something's insanely overpowered, at least in VGC, you sort of just have to deal with it. Smogon is a different philosophy, and they are willing to ban things if most of the community feels that it's the right thing to do, and most people agree that it's hurting the metagame, making it a worse experience. Dracovish was certainly doing that. Dracovish was an auto-include on every team, and so was Seismitoad. So you basically have -2 Pokemon slots on every team, and a lot of the gameplay is centered around just getting Dracovish in and clicking one move. You know, Pokemon players, they want variety. They want to run multiple different kinds of offensive threats that can do different things, excel in different areas. And whenever you have one Pokemon that is really dominating in that field, it reduces that variety. Yes, we could still be playing the Dracovish meta if we wanted. It's still a valid competitive game, I suppose, where there could skillful gameplay to be had, and you could just play around Dracovish, and it's all about Dracovish. But at the end of the day, it is community sentiment and opinions on the quality of the actual gameplay taking place that I think drives whether something gets banned or not in Smogon's rule sets. A counterpoint to this that I've heard, and why some people take issue with the Smogon system, is that a competitive metagame of any sort needs time to develop. We don't know what's going to be good 5 years down the line, and if you keep banning things and iterating on the rule set constantly, you're sort of stifling that. I mean, what if in a couple of years Dracovish sucks because the metagame has shifted in a way to make it no longer the threat it once was? Some people think that if you just let players adapt and let the metagame develop on its own, things will sort of fix themselves, and there have been examples of this in other competitive games. Super Smash Bros. Melee, for example, is exactly the same game as it was when it released. There have been no balance patches, no modifications to characters. They are all exactly the same. And yet the tier list for Melee in the early days looks completely different to the tier list of the modern metagame. In early tier lists, Sheik was considered the #1 character, and characters like Yoshi and Donkey Kong were very low rated. In modern tier lists, players have developed Yoshi and Donkey Kong significantly more, and they are much higher on the tier list. Sheik is no longer #1, Fox is #1. These metagame shifts didn't happen because Donkey Kong was buffed or Sheik was nerfed, it's because players adapted, and the metagame developed on its own accord without interference. To some extent, this is a valid perspective, and some of the greatest competitive games of all time are mostly unchanged from when they released. In the case of Melee, this is a positive thing, and it's part of the game's identity. But there are also plenty examples of the opposite thing happening. Maybe a competitive game has an incredibly overpowered strategy in it, and nothing is done about it, and it slowly ruins the game. In Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Meta Knight is by far and away the most powerful character in the game, and there is nobody else even close. Most of the characters in Super Smash Bros. Brawl are completely unusable, with few exceptions. Now, some people do enjoy Super Smash Bros. Brawl and find Meta Knight to be a compelling character, but you can't deny that this has affected the legacy of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and there's far less interest in it as a competitive game, because of the lack of variety and how this incredibly central and dominant strategy really stifles any variety whatsoever. And games like Melee that are really good in their base state are rare. They're kind of like unicorns. It doesn't happen that often. Most games require balance and iteration to reach a enjoyable state, or at least to keep variety alive in the metagame. And this is the case even when the developers are specifically designing a competitive game. It's very difficult to get it right on the first try, and almost every game like this ends up having balance issues that have to be fixed. So with competitive singles, you have a Pokemon format that was not really designed to be a competitive game. And for this reason, it's very easy for things to be overpowered in competitive Pokemon singles, like Dracovish, and like Blaziken with Speed Boost, or Cloyster with Shell Smash in Generation 5. A lot of people are on board with the basic idea of this ethos. Some things are really broken in competitive singles, obviously so, like Dracovish, or Galarian Darmanitan, or in Gen 9, Chi-Yu. These guys that just click one really strong attack that is dealing way too much damage that there's not enough defensive counterplay to, and it dominates the metagame to an unhealthy extent. Obviously that should be banned, but not every ban is so unanimously agreed upon. Things get a little bit controversial sometimes, even within the competitive singles community. And in Gen 9 OU, I feel like Smogon has changed their ethos a lot, and are actually doing bans significantly more, which has caused a lot of backlash. I made a video recently where I went over every single ban that has taken place in Gen 9 OU so far. And it came to a total of 31 bans, which is kind of insane, and a lot of people, rightly so, have had difficulty following Gen 9 OU because of how often the format actually changes and how difficult it is to keep up with what's banned and what isn't, and how much that shifts the metagame every time a ban happens. Most people understand when, in Gen 4 they banned Salamence, or in Gen 5 they banned Blaziken with Speed Boost. People understand these things. But there might be a bit more contention about banning Gen 9 Pokemon like Gouging Fire and Roaring Moon. In the past, it felt like most bans were pretty obvious, and most of the community agreed. There were some contrarians that came in and said, why would you ban Mega Gengar? But most people understand that Mega Gengar is insane, and it makes the metagame bad. But in Gen 9 there is more disagreement. Things are more split down the middle, and bans are happening so often that people are questioning whether Overused should actually have a rethink about what it represents. This is largely an attitude spearheaded by Finchinator, the current OU tier leader, who is of the opinion that more action should be taken more frequently. Problems should be addressed quickly. And also with more community involvement, because surveys have been used this time around frequently to gauge opinion about certain Pokemon in the metagame and take action based on those results. I think that as the power level of the franchise itself has shifted, the attitude Smogon has towards tiering has had to shift in turn. Pokemon has never been designed around competitive singles, and this is evident with many examples, but in Gen 9 it feels most egregious. There are so many mechanics and Pokemon that are absolutely game-breaking in competitive singles. One example is Last Respect, a ghost-type attack that scales for every single fainted ally. This is specifically incredibly overpowered in 6v6 because up to 5 of your allies can faint, increasing the power of Last Respect so much that it can one-hit KO anything regardless of whether they resist you or not. In VGC's doubles format, this move is not a problem at all, and it's never used in competitive, I think. I don't think it's ever been used, because you can only bring 4 Pokemon to a game, restricting how powerful the move can actually be. And also, it can only hit one target at a time, and not many Pokemon actually get it. The terrestrialization mechanic is also extraordinarily overpowered in singles, with so many different ways it can be abused. To enable free turns for boost sweepers, which are inherently more powerful in singles as there's just one opponent and one Pokemon on your side. It almost feels like Gen 9 is breaking the Smogon philosophy, because even Smogon isn't always sure of what to do and no one really agrees anymore. That's how it feels. Some people have this attitude that it's not even possible to create a balanced Gen 9 metagame, so just embrace that everything's going to be broken because it's unfixable. Some people think even more bans should still be taking place on Pokemon like Ogerpon Wellspring, Kyurem and King Gambit, who are extraordinarily powerful. It's kind of interesting to think about, because Smogon's philosophy behind tiering has worked fine for a while. In Gen 8, I think it worked well, because after all the bans that took place in Gen 8, the result was a pretty diverse and well-liked competitive metagame. It took a while to get there, but eventually what resulted from Smogon's philosophy was a good competitive game that people still enjoy to this day, being Gen 8 OU. I don't know. I think that what people take issue with is that 31 bans feels clunky. In VGC, there's a clear rule set that is easy to follow. You know what's legal and what's not. In OU, there are 31 bans that have taken place. The metagame has shifted so many times, and it's still not even in a perfect state. It's easy to understand the confusion, and frankly I think that Gen 9 just hasn't been a great competitive metagame. It's improved over time, I think, with their action, but it is just a difficult one to figure out what to do with. Competitive games are some of the hardest to design, and when this design philosophy of balance and order is left in the hands of the fans, things can get weird. There's a lot of disagreement about who should even be in charge of this, what should be done, and what it even means to have a balanced metagame. What is the blueprint for that? What does that look like? Now, I don't think that VGC formats are perfectly balanced either, but at least they are simple and uniform. This is appealing to a lot of people because the rule set is the rule set, and if something's really broken in a specific rule set, it's sort of okay because that's just the meta for that rule set, and in the next one it'll be different. You know that a new rule set's coming later. I guess the difference in Smogon's formats is that if something's a problem, there's more incentive to address it, because if you don't, you're going to be stuck with it forever. It's going to be part of the format's identity forever. In some Smogon formats, this is a problem, like Latios in Gen 5 OU, a Pokemon that has never been banned and to this day is on almost every team and is incredibly central to the point of being borderline overpowered in the eyes of many. Now, even though I cover Gen 9 OU, I cover the tier shifts and I highlight cool teams that I see and interesting metagame shifts. I have to be honest and say that I don't really play the metagame myself. Frankly, I think it kind of sucks. I suppose where I differ on this from others, though, is that I don't blame Smogon for that. Maybe I disagree with the sleep ban or unbanning Darkrai or some stuff like that, but overall I don't think that those two things would really save the metagame if they were different. I think it's an interesting metagame to talk about, and the chaos of it and the divisiveness of it is dramatic and fun and interesting, but I think it's a bad metagame, and I have no real desire to sink my teeth into it and invest in. And this is where I get a little confused with some of the backlash Smogon receives, because it is incredibly easy to just not play Gen 9 OU and play one of the million other formats that they have on the website. And if you are someone that prefers a metagame that is rather set in stone, where bans pretty much never happen, if they do, it's like 1 or 2 bans, Ubers is right there. You could literally just play Ubers, which is a very popular metagame in its own right, and in some ways is more balanced and uniform and sensical than OU is, in multiple generations. I think Smogon sounds very dramatic. It sounds like a shadow organization scheming to ban your favorite Pokemon. Really, it's something more interesting and complex than that. It's a grassroots competitive community that was born out of a demand to play competitive Pokemon before such a thing was feasible in an official context. And the ethos of what Smogon's formats look like has evolved over time and had to shift with the increasing power level of the franchise and its own shift towards official, rivaling competitive formats. Perhaps in the same way that people describe competitive metagames evolving and becoming something completely distinct as a result of years of development and metagame refinement. Perhaps the same exact thing is happening with Smogon itself, this very unique case of a fan community in a competitive game that exists independently of its official competitors. You can disagree with me if you want, but I'm honestly of the opinion that grassroots competitive scenes are always more interesting than official ones. If you're a fan of competitive Valorant, more power to you, but I look at this and I see a soulless product forced to be an esport with the edges sanded to perfection. This does not have character. On Smogon there is a format called Little Cup, where everything's level 5 and you can only use baby Pokemon. One of the top Pokemon of the metagame is Mudbray. Most people who have tried Little Cup love it, because it's fun, it's fast-paced, and it's one of the best ways to play competitive singles, plus everything's a cute baby Pokemon. The people who organize and govern over Little Cup make $0 and 0 cents. They're doing it because it's cool. Because wouldn't it be fun if I could use Stunky or Grookey competitively? Yes, it would, and someone made it because it was fun. The Pokemon Company would never make something as cool as Little Cup. It just would never happen. And if you waste any of your time and energy saying that Little Cup is not an official format, it is not endorsed by Nintendo or Game Freak, then I think you're a dweeb and you should be quiet. Thank you for watching.